The UN and our Department of Energy Secretary of Energy says it's a $32 trillion book of business. And that just seems mind-blowing in a sense, but it's because significant global investment from Fortune 500 companies, that ranges from investor-owned utilities to our traditional oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil to venture capitalists.
Welcome to the Stantec.io podcast, where we speak to our scientists, designers, engineers, and architects who are combining subject matter expertise with cutting-edge technology to develop digital solutions that can help solve the problems of today and tomorrow. My name's Dave Roberts.
And I'm Mike Arsenault. This may be one of our most ambitious episodes to date, as we're going to cover a topic that many consider essential to the sustainability of human existence, the energy transition away from fossil fuels toward clean energy. And there's no debate that the global climate is changing, and our reliance on fossil fuels has catalyzed that change. The faster we make the transition to clean energy, the better. And joining us to discuss how we get there is Michael Johnson.
Michael is a senior vice president in the power sector of our environmental services business and is based in Northern California. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Well, thank you, David and Mike. Really excited to be here. And this is a topic that's obviously near and dear to my heart. So thank you.
Well, Michael, before we really dig in, can you tell us why you're uniquely qualified for this topic and why you're helping to lead the charge on energy transition from a Stantec perspective?
Well, the energy transition has true meaning to me and my family and our community, as in California, we're often faced with wildfire impacts, and our utilities have been doing power shutoffs, and we're seeing impacts to our water and other things. So the energy transition is a solution to our climate change, and it's extremely important to us personally, but our clients are faced with quickly changing environments, and they need our help. So with my law background in business consulting, I've been supporting the energy clients for 25 plus years in their capital expenditure projects, ranging from a Southern California Edison or Berkshire Hathaway Energy on their transmission and PSEP programs, to ExxonMobil and multiple independent power producers and venture capitalists on the exploration into cleaner fuels. And at Stantec, I have a really great opportunity to help us lead our global energy transition initiative, which is focused on client partnerships and investment involving grid modernization, hydrogen solutions, energy advisory decarbonization solutions, and lastly, our carbon capture underground sequestration. So it's something that's really, really important to our clients, our shareholders, our communities, and my family personally.
Well, that's excellent. So, Michael, let's start as wide as possible. Globally, right now in 2024, what is the market outlook for the transition to clean energy?
It's big, Dave. And to provide you with some specifics, the UN and our Department of Energy Secretary of Energy says it's a $32 trillion book of business. And that just seems mind-blowing in a sense, but it's because significant global investment from Fortune 500 companies, that ranges from investor-owned utilities to our traditional oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil to venture capitalists. And most notably, recently in the UN COP28 conference, which outlined an unprecedented framework for the need to address climate change via the energy transition. So what does that really mean in terms of how we look at it? Well, at the heart of the energy transition, there's really three drivers that is really pushing this forward. One is the regulatory side of things, and that's via legislation. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act and DOE grants that are really making it very, very profitable for investment. But on the risk side, in terms of regulatory, there's a lot of ongoing litigation as it relates to climate change with utilities. So often many of these utilities are trying to reduce their enterprise risk management via the energy transition and looking at cleaner fuels. The second component of the energy transition is shareholder pressure. All of us, including Stantec shareholders and our clients, we all have choices in where we want to invest. And shareholders are becoming more and more selective on investing in companies that have very, very aggressive decarbonization objectives. And then lastly, it's all about money in terms of the energy transition. It's a very profitable investment, and the stock market shows that.
Michael, that's great to hear about the drivers for that clean energy transition. But what about companies and organizations or even governments that are hesitant to embrace the transition from, let's say, a political or a social or employment upheaval perspective? How do you get them on board?
That's a great question, Mike. And I'm not sure if you saw a couple of weeks ago, Warren Buffett, who's been very, very aggressive in investment in energy transition and climate change, recently stated that the greatest impact to the energy transition, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, is the lack of certainty. And that lack of certainty in terms of how to proceed a path forward really impacts investors. Investors want certainty, and the greater certainty they have, the more investment. So what does that mean? Well, you need to have the political will and regulators approving a project on an agreed upon timeline. That's been a real issue in the US and in Canada in terms of the political will, where you have major transmission, electrical transmission being planned, but it's involving multi-state, multi-jurisdictions in both Canada and the US. And sometimes that creates great delays. Well, those great delays brings about uncertainty to an investor. With many countries now providing both tax incentives and grants, investors are able to really reap the benefits of both the upfront grant money for their project development, as well as seeing tax incentives during the operations. That is positive in terms of bringing about certainty for investors. And it's really our job at Stantec and as leaders to provide greater certainty for our clients. And we do that by providing both business and traditional A&E consulting to map out a path forward for decarbonization that is profitable, that is clear with clear milestones. And then we help them execute those plans via project development and through construction and even operations.
And what about from a regulatory perspective? Yeah, incentives will be different depending on what part of the world you're living in. So can you provide some examples around how these incentives differ between regions and countries?
Absolutely, Dave. And you're spot on in terms of they differ greatly country to country. In the United States, there's both Department of Energy grant funding, which really incentivizes the investor and the project developer to go forward with their projects because they have the upfront money to fund those projects. And then once they're funded and developed, there's also the Inflation Reduction Act legislation that provides tax incentives in support of the operation of those energy transition projects. That brings about great clarity and certainty for investors. And that's why we're seeing so much energy transition related development in the United States. In Canada, on the other hand, energy demand is flat. And that's largely because of various requirements, but also political drivers. There's great uncertainty on the renewable development side as it relates to solar and wind, but green hydrogen is a big focus, and the government is providing large tax incentives for green hydrogen and its development. And the UK, totally different situation. 48% of the UK's electricity stems from renewables. And a large driver of that is the UK's government tax incentives encouraging both renewable and transition development. Some of its largest transmission projects are being developed by National Grid, and green hydrogen is another aspect that is seeing greater focus. In the Netherlands, it has the SDE++ legislation, and that's really operating as a grant funding mechanism that aims to help in achieving the government's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. So extremely aggressive, and the Netherlands is all in terms of government funding. And considering the global investment in renewable and energy capacity from 2010 to 2019, as it relates to the energy transition, it's clear that China it's really invested about $758 billion. The US is about half that. Japan is around $200 billion. Germany's around $200 billion. And then the UK is right up there, just above $100 billion that are leading the race in terms of legislation, funding, grants, and investment in the energy transition globally.
Well, that's fantastic. Michael, can you tell us more about the investor-owned utilities model? And do you think that could be somewhat of a secret weapon in the transition to clean energy?
That's a great question, Dave. And I absolutely believe it is the secret weapon in the energy transition. We're seeing significant investment from shareholders and venture capitalists alike supporting investor-owned utilities in the US. and throughout Europe. It's really overseeing cleaner generation through renewable development and then moving that cleaner energy through major transmission projects. It's also looking at ways to reduce emissions through other technology by closing down old dated coal peaker plants and replacing them with small nuclear modular reactors, SMRs. Hydro and pump storage is becoming a major focus now of specific investor-owned utilities. But with that said, and I know I mentioned Warren Buffett in the past, and he's one of the greatest investors in IOUs, is to his point that IOUs are evolving as we speak. And part of that is shareholders and investors want greater certainty. So Berkshire Hathaway Energy is no different than PG&E or Southern California Edison or even NextEra and Dominion, where climate change has provided some significant enterprise risk issues that they're battling with. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's impacting their aggressive integrated resource management plans, IRPs, which show a big time shift to renewable development and transmission to support that. IOUs are shifting as a model, and it's because of the solid returns on transmission and renewable development. But with IOUs, we could see a sell-off on distributions, levees, dams to public utility districts, wanting to see greater local control. But it's also because IOUs want to reduce their risk around wildfire issues and climate change as such.
Now, producing clean energy is one thing, Michael, but getting it to where it needs to go is another. I've done some research, and in terms of producing the amount of clean energy that we would need globally, that's not really that difficult if we continue on the track we are going. It's getting it to where it needs to go. So grid modernization is really fraught with some bureaucratic challenges. Can you just define a couple of those and maybe give us some solutions that you have to that issue?
Absolutely, Mike. And you're right. Some of the big bureaucratic challenges are impacting many of our targeted clients at Stantec, whether it's an investor-owned utility trying to develop a major transmission program involving multiple states or jurisdictions, to our energy clients or traditional oil and gas clients that are trying to diversify and get into areas of cleaner energy development that they're not used to doing, such as offshore wind, solar, and onshore wind. So with that, in terms of Stantec, it's really our job to help map out a lower decarbonization path forward, and then allow our project managers to support our clients in terms of project development, which can be very, very challenging. Many IOUs, including National Grid in the UK to Berkshire Hathaway, now have project management offices, PMOs, to maneuver through some of these pre-construction requirements and bureaucracy. And this requires a specific skill set and experience. So our PMs, for example, have PMP certifications, which I strongly feel is a requisite for execution and continuous improvement. Because these large energy transition projects either involve shareholder investments or VC or, the regulated utilities, scorecards and analytics are an absolute must, showing true value and a path getting beyond the bureaucracy, providing greater certainty.
So are there some forms of clean energy that are more viable to the transition than others? For example, solar, wind, or perhaps geothermal?
Yeah, I really believe hydrogen is the big solution going forward. And I think many of our clients do too in investors. But I gotta ask, what's up with all the colors in hydrogen? It's a really moving, evolving technology and energy transition solution. But right now we got everything from blue hydrogen to green hydrogen to pink to turquoise. It's greatly moving, but it's something that is absolutely going to be a game changer going forward. And many of our utilities are looking at that as a change going from natural gas to possibly hydrogen. Of course, they have the pipelines to support that. Now it's just a matter of the technology of taking, hydrogen and through electricity and other means, changing it into the form of ammonia and transporting it in a safe manner. But it is really, really beyond exciting to see how, for example, the Department of Energy hydrogen hubs are evolving and the role of investor-owned utilities And the SoCal Gas Angeles Link program could be the model to follow. And there's a lot of money behind it. There's also been a significant movement in offshore wind regarding its investment in technology. I see this as a viable focus in the near term as investors are kind of grappling with how technology is changing and ways to become more efficient, which drives greater profitability. So yeah, I do believe beyond just nuclear, hydro, solar, and onshore wind, I think hydrogen is the biggest focus and solution, along with offshore wind as a major play for the energy transition.
Okay, Michael, before we let you go, I'm going to ask you to put on your prognostication hat. Where do you think we're going to be 10 years from now on this energy transition?
Well, Mike, I love to joke around about this answer, but it has some real truth around it. I see the future of the energy transition and what we look at as a society not too far off from the Jetsons and the cartoon. I really think that EV, local utility control, individual options via apps on our phone, our cost models in terms of investor-owned utilities and regulated utilities and how they can make money off of energy transport and generation, how we can reduce expense for the individual user is all going to be different. And it was kind of a pipe dream 10 years ago about electric vehicles. And now many of our utilities are looking at that in battery storage and at the individual homes as a means of really being able to operate better and having that individual options using our phone, how we use energy, how we pay for energy is going to be a real game changer. I also think that large investor-owned utilities are going to be more about transmission and in some means overseeing large renewable or clean generation. But it's not going to be the model going forward in terms of cost control for distribution. And I think it's going to be more microgrids and again, battery storage, the use of our EVs for that. And the biggest driver of that is climate change. It's really forcing us to think differently as users. We want more local control. And that's why public utility districts are also going to be seeing more and more of the distribution versus the traditional large investor-owned utilities overseeing that.
Well, that's excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk this today, Michael. Our transition from fossil fuels to clean energy is such a critical transformation for every single one of us. And it's been great to hear how Stantec is playing a critical role in this global change and enabling that shift to a more sustainable world. So thank you once again for being part of the Stantec.io podcast.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Mike.
And thank you for listening. Future episodes will continue to explore how digital solutions are shaping our world. In the meantime, you can also visit our website at www.stantec.io for more information.